All right, Year 12 Global Politics. This next video is going to look at the different responses from global actors to the issue of climate change, as well as their effectiveness. In my previous video, I said that we haven't actually seen in the last few years of the current state of design a question that specifically says to evaluate the effectiveness of responses to a global crisis. So, we haven't seen it since 2015. All the other questions that have asked people to evaluate the effectiveness of referring, they include, a key term like unilateralism or international cooperation. So we haven't actually seen a question that explicitly says to evaluate the effectiveness of responses. So some teachers are starting to speculate that in 2021, there could be a question on this, but you never know. You've got to prepare for everything. So yeah, we'll have to wait and see. So here in this video, I'm going to talk about the different responses that we have looked at in class and talk about what they've done well, as well as what they have not done well, because that's what an evaluate and that's what the effectiveness is all about. So let's get into it. So let's start with China. China has been a world leader when it comes to climate change, and well, really because of their work in renewable energy. They are producing 3 times as much as any other state. And, they continue to be really the leader of the world when it comes to renewable energy, which is helping increase their international standing. So this could be a, sorry, I'm trying to do 2 things at once. These could all be examples that you use for power in the Asia Pacific in Unit 3, Outcome 2. So we've got here China being a world leader because of renewable energy. They've also been a world leader because in the Paris Climate Agreement, obviously the US signed up, but then when the Trump administration came to power, they were skeptical of it and they withdrew. They also withdrew because of the economic reasons. Like they list a whole bunch of economic reasons. But China stayed, and China stuck true to the Paris Climate Agreement. So, I think here we need to acknowledge that they have done some good things when it comes to climate change and have tried to be a world leader in this area. Their responses have been perceived favorably, and they are going to achieve both their 2020 and 2030 pledges. The pledge for 2030 is that they will lower carbon dioxide emissions by 60 to 65% from their 2005 levels by 2030. So to put that kind of into perspective, Australia has committed itself to 26 to 28%. So China's pretty much doubled that. They are the largest emitter of CO2 in the world, but they have taken quite a big step here. They have also said that they will peak their carbon emissions by 2030 and try to peak them earlier than that. So those are their 2 main goals. They also have introduced a number of domestic policies that are good for climate change. So this is where we are talking about unilateral responses. Some of those policies include, well, I guess here, this one is about tackling deforestation, because they are planning on increasing forest stock by around 6 billion cubic meters in 2030. So increasing the number of trees that they have in the world, therefore they are also adding to the carbon sinks that have been lost in the world. So that's good. That's what they're planning on doing. They have also have installed wind and solar power and plan to do this by 2030. They've introduced a new carbon emissions trading market, have invested $1 trillion into cleaning up the air, water and soil, increased non-fossil fuels in primary energy consumption, to about 15% in 2020 and 20% in 2030. Now, I'll talk about all of them first. And then they are promoting the sale and manufacturing of electric vehicles. So yeah, they have done quite a lot in this space. I think what's good about some of this is that they are trying to mitigate. Remember, mitigation is a key aspect. And so when we're talking about mitigation, this really is addressing the causes of climate change. So increasing forest stock, they're addressing the cause, which is deforestation, by planting more trees. They are trying to use non-fossil fuels. So that means that they are trying to then reduce their carbon emissions. So really they're doing a lot of mitigating here. They're trying to address the causes of climate change, trying to rely more on renewable energy than what they've done in the past. So these are the good things that they have done. They tried to be an international leader. They have more renewable energy, and they are trying to mitigate the causes of climate change. So that's what China has done well. However, there are still some significant issues with China with the issue of climate change. One of them is that they are still the world's largest emitter of CO2. This is due to their reliance on coal. And, they're in a bit of a pickle because they need coal. Well, they say they need coal for economic prosperity. They need to continue to grow economically. However, they are relying very heavily on coal. There's other ways to grow. You don't need just coal, but it's cheap to do it. So that's why a lot of states do it. So they are polluting still a considerable amount of CO2, relying on coal as well. So according to Climate Action Tracker, China's nationally determined contributions, so what they have actually come up with, are highly insufficient in regards to the issue of climate, in regards to what they have said they would do for the Paris Climate Agreement. But they have said their domestic policies are headed towards a slightly better rating, maybe an insufficient rating. So still not great, but they have got domestic policies here that are going to mitigate the causes of climate change. We've got, the forests and renewable energy that they have done well, but, their reliance on coal really is the biggest issue, I think, that we have going on. So they, in 2019, 58% of the world's total energy consumption came from coal. They rely very heavily on coal, which helps explain why China accounts for 28% of the world's global CO2 emissions. So, we still have an issue here. We are still, although they are trying to use renewable energy, 58% of the world's energy is coming from coal. They still are relying very heavily on it. So, this isn't really a very effective response when we're talking about here that we have to be mitigating, which means, we have to reduce our emissions. So we need to stop relying on coal and come up with other ways to do it. But China are relying very heavily on coal. So much so that we have seen China continue to build coal-fired power plants. They have committed to still, a number of power plant investments. In 2020, a total of 247 gigawatts of coal power is now in planning or development. We should be seeing China and other states backing away from coal. However, here we're seeing the opposite. So that's not very good, and it's not a very good look for China that should be leading the way and trying to avoid the use of coal. So overall, it's been a pretty mixed response. It's good because of renewable energy. It's good because they, are increasing carbon sinks by planting trees. But we are seeing an issue here because they are they are relying very heavily on coal. And coal, as we know, is a fossil fuel, and fossil fuels contribute to the issue of climate change. So that's making their response ineffective. Another response has been by the United Nations. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually just explain what United Nations have done for climate change, and a bit about the Paris Climate Agreement. So to start off with, obviously climate change is not a new issue, and it's been discussed since really the 90s. So it started really under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and this was set up in 1994. 197 states ratified the convention. So they all signed up to the convention, all aiming to work together to prevent the human impact of climate change, for humans to stop polluting. So it's been in the works since 1994. Then we have a very recent agreement that took place. It was really very significant, and I think mainly because of how many states signed on to it. It came into place on the 4th of November 2016 and has been ratified by 189 countries, including the EU, and represents 88% of the world's emissions. So it's significant because of how many countries have signed on to it. And because there's so many countries involved, it's really become legitimate. It's legitimate now because there's so many countries involved, and it's representing such a large amount of the world's emissions. If you agreed to be part of the Paris Climate Agreement, the only states that didn't agree were Iran, Turkey, and Iraq, who are the major emitters. The US, as we know, briefly dropped out but have rejoined. But if you signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, it's basically said that you had to set emission reduction pledges, which are known as nationally determined contributions, so NDC. And basically here we're saying that you were going to take action in your country to prevent temperatures from rising above 2 degrees. So above 2 degrees Celsius, so above the pre-industrial levels, and you want to try and keep it below 1.5 degrees. At the time in 2016, it was predicted that the world was heading towards 3.5 degrees, and that was very scary. There was a lot of devastating impacts that would happen. So all countries basically had to set a reduction plan, and it would be their pledge to help prevent the rising of temperatures. It wasn't actually specified as something legally binding, but they said that they would like to reach net zero emissions. And that means basically that the amount of greenhouse gases you are emitting, so the ones that you are sending out, equals the amount removed from the atmosphere. So I guess imagine scales, what you're producing is the same, and what you're producing in terms of carbon is the same as what you are taking away, which is that you're maybe using renewable energies. Then they said that every 5 years countries had to assess their project with global stocktake. The first is planned for 2023. Countries also can set their own targets. There's no enforcement mechanisms to ensure that they meet them, which is troubling, but that it's very different with international law. International law is not held in the same regard as domestic law. So, that's bound to happen. It's obvious. We need to probably kind of ignore this being, something ineffective, because really, when it comes to these issues, the fact that we even have an agreement shows that the world care and that they want to do something about it. Then also the next meeting is planned in November 2021. Okay, so to keep going, how is it effective? Well, the biggest effectiveness is how many states are part of it and the fact that they represent 88% of the world's emitters. And the largest emitters, like the US and China, are part of it. So if we have, the leaders of the world and the people that have the worst amount of emissions or the most amount of emissions, we will see some changes take place and the world will want to follow in their direction. Major emitters, though, like Iran, Turkey, and Iraq aren't. And that is probably partly due to standing. They're not too concerned about their reputation on a global stage. So it's been effective because also we have seen, temperatures were meant to rise to 3.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. But it's now flattened to 2.9 degrees Celsius. So obviously that's not great. We need to get to 1.5, but we have seen, the trajectory lower. What's also been interesting is it has sparked action by TNCs, and these TNCs have probably in some part been more effective than states. They've been more likely to take on board and want to make a difference because it does make their company look good. So this resulted in the climate pledge, which was started by Amazon and Global Optimism. Basically, it's a situation where there's 100 TNCs who have all signed the pledge and are all agreeing to net zero emissions by 2040, which is great. It's basically sparked further action by the TNCs. States are held accountable through the Enhanced Transparency Framework. Basically, all countries need to submit the emissions inventories. They need to be tracking their progress and how effective they've been in achieving their nationally determined contribution. These reports will be then reviewed by technical experts and will then consider basically the progress by states. So states are going to be held accountable and evaluated on their progress, which is good. It's good. So obviously for some developing states, the changes that they need to make towards, reducing global temperatures is hard and is going to cost them a lot of money. So to combat that, in the Paris Climate Agreement, the Green Climate Fund was established, and they said they would give $100 billion for this. So $100 billion a year would be given to developing countries to have access to this money to help them. And, in 2015, a good example of international standing here, China gave $3 billion. So there you go. That is a good thing that states are trying to do here to help those developing states. A very recent change we've started to see is also this push for net zero. 2/3 of the world's global economies are part of it. That is China, US, Japan, and South Korea that have all said that they would achieve net zero. And if they all actually follow through with this, this will lead to the temperature rise being 2.1 degrees Celsius, which is much closer to the 2015 promise of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that would be good. That's what we want. So these are what has been good about the Paris Climate Agreement. However, we need to always acknowledge the negatives. And the negatives, there's been quite a few. The first is that, the Green Climate Fund, which said that they would try to have $100 billion a year for developing countries, in 2018 only raised $10.3 billion. We've seen countries even like Australia and the US pull out of this. Also, there's been criticism that it's not enough to limit the rise of temperatures by 1.5 degrees Celsius. At the moment, we're headed for 2.9 degrees, which is obviously better than the 3.5 degrees, but it's not enough. we need more. And, as said by the CRF, it's, a first step. We need to be doing more, and, countries need to have greater ambitions to cut their emissions. So really, this climate agreement really should be a stepping stone to bigger and better things. One key target is to reduce emissions in order to reduce rising temperatures. However, we have still seen emissions grow. Emissions in 2015 were about 50 billion tonnes, and in 2019 they had risen to 55 billion tonnes. That's not good. We need to really be lowering that. And although, yes, China said that they would peak their emissions before 2030, implying then that they can continue to grow, we need to be lowering it as soon as possible. And it's troubling to see that, emissions grew by 5 billion tonnes during this time. So yeah, there's been some criticism of the Paris Climate Agreement. We've got here also a quote by the former UN General Secretary or Secretary General. And basically, we have not done enough, is what he's saying. And then the UNEP has reported in 2020 that fossil fuels planned to increase 2% per year. So we have still seen an increase in fossil fuels in the world. All right. This is just altogether kind of just like a bad response to climate change, and an ineffective unilateral response to climate change. So, under the Paris Climate Agreement, Brazil said that it would eliminate illegal deforestation by 2030 and replant 11 million hectares. However, under the government of Bolsonaro, we've actually seen the opposite. Government regulations were loosened, and we've seen deforestation occur. There was 74,000 fires in 2018. And obviously there was action by the G7 to help fight fires, but that was rejected. So really what we've seen here is an ineffective response to the issue of climate change by Brazil. They've said that they would, eliminate deforestation. However, we've seen it occur. And the fires are still continuing. In 2020, fires in the Amazon rose by 20%, which was a 13-year high. So it's really been overall quite an ineffective response here to climate change. Okay, now when we've got Australia, Australia's response has been, really linked quite strongly to national interests. We have a strong involvement with mining. We rely very heavily on mines. And so that has really shaped a lot of our responses to it. But in terms of what's been effective, under the Paris Climate Agreement, Australia committed itself to 26 to 28% reductions by 2030. So that was actually something that they have agreed to. We have a National Energy Productivity Plan, the NEP. Basically, under this project, it's about using efficient appliances and technology, increasing the efficiency of ratings throughout everything that we are using. The aim here is to reduce greenhouse emissions. And the government expects that NEP will contribute to over 1/4 of the emissions reduction required to meet the 2030 target. And that, we've become, the energy productivity has increased to 17%. So, it's about here having good energy products and to enhance energy productivity. So that's one response. We also have the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which committed to a further $944 million to energy efficiency projects. $1 $100 million to transport, and $1.1 billion to renewable energy projects. So there has been some push towards renewable energies, which is, mitigating, trying to reduce the emissions that way, which is good. Also, Australia has committed itself to $12.1 million towards more renewable energy projects. So there has been money thrown in that direction. It shows that then the government do care about this issue. They just are really, politicians are kind of tied towards these mining companies because of the economic benefits it brings to Australia. So, for example, in terms of what Australia has done poorly, we'll just start off with the Climate Action Tracker have called Australia's response to climate change as insufficient, headed towards highly insufficient, which is not good. Under the Paris Climate Agreement, we obviously just saw that they agreed to 26 to 28% by 2030. However, according to current predictions, Australia will only get to 16% lower than 2005 levels in 2030. And the reason for this really is because we are using carryover credits from the Kyoto target, which means that, what we did under Kyoto, they're saying, well, we've already done that work there. So we're going to use that, what we've done in the past to kind of add to our tally to say that we've done it well. So, many states have called this cheating because a lot of other states met their Kyoto targets or did stuff for the Kyoto targets. So all we're doing here is just, every country has done the same thing as us with Kyoto. We're just saying that we would like to add that to our Paris Climate Agreement tally. So really instead of making 26 to 28%, we're only maybe going to make 14%. So that's what's been done poorly. Also, we have the Emissions Reduction Fund, where the government will pay corporations money when they have actually lowered their emissions. And people just think that's an inefficient way of doing it because we're paying polluters for emission reductions, which probably would have been happening anyway without this scheme. According to the Climate Change Authority, they said that this emissions reductions, or the ERF scheme is unlikely to deliver sufficient emissions reductions to the minimum of the 2020 target. So really, it hasn't been very effective there. Also, internationally, there was a virtual climate summit in April 2021, and Australia did not commit to net zero emissions by 2050 there. A number of countries did. According to a list by the UN, out of 170 countries, Australia is ranked last with their work towards climate change. So in summary, really, Australia it's getting worse towards their actions towards climate change. Went from being insufficient to now being highly insufficient. So that's not good. Our next global actor to look at is the US. The US is an interesting one because there's really two sides to it. We have Biden, who has taken some strong actions towards climate change. It's been, a key focus for him. Whereas we have then really the opposite when, Trump decided to pull out the Paris Climate Agreement. So under the Biden administration, he has made climate change a significant focus. As soon as he rejoined office, or as soon as he came into office, he re-signed the Paris Climate Agreement. He placed, limits on oil and gas activity. He's set the tone to say that climate change is a key focus for him. Internationally, he's also tried to put his best foot forward by hosting a virtual climate summit in April of 2021. In that meeting, he increased the, pledge to the Paris Climate Agreement and said that they would try to achieve 50 to 52% by 2030. which would help them reach net zero by 2050, which is good. He also, in the G7 summit in June 2021, pledged $100 billion per year to help states cut their emissions. So obviously trying to boost the US's international standing here. And it's also trying to kind of compete here with China. You know, this is part of their Build Back Better World, which is the rival of the Belt and Road Initiative. So yeah, that's really their ways to try and boost, I guess, the US's presence in the international community and try to make, you know, a difference with climate change. However, he still is supporting, Joe Biden is still supporting oil and gas leases. The US is still the second largest producer of carbon emissions per capita. But there are steps here to suggest that Biden is working towards climate change. And, you know, under the Trump administration, it was regarded as critically insufficient by Climate Action Tracker. So, you know, they were regarded insufficient. They weren't leading the way because they did withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. So they weren't doing well. He also replaced the Clean Power Plant, which would have limited carbon emissions from coal and gas-fired power plants. So there were some negative things that Trump administration did do. However, emissions did decrease in 2006. So from 2006, there was 6.6 billion tonnes. However, in 2019, it was 5.1 billion tonnes. So they still were trying to do the right thing towards climate change there, which is good. All right, so our final global actor that we can look at is Volkswagen. It's good to look at a TNC because they, I guess, sometimes offer a different perspective, and what we can use the information here for 3.1 under, you know, progress and innovation by TNC, but we'll get to that. So Volkswagen have tried to take positive steps towards climate change. You know, they've themselves have committed to the Paris Climate Agreement. They have aimed to reduce carbon footprint of cars and light commercial vehicles by 30% compared to 2015. And again, they're getting on the bandwagon here. They're trying to make themselves CO2 neutral or reach net zero by 2050. So they are following in the direction of what a number of states and other corporations are doing. 2050 want to be CO2 neutral. Also, this could be a good example. In Lower Saxony, they are phasing out coal. You know, phasing out coal is really good for mitigation, you know, reducing the cause of climate change, which is burning fossil fuels. They have converted power stations from coal to natural gas, which has then resulted in a decrease in emissions from the previous year. So these are the good things that they are doing. Really, that's quite a few effective responses here. Achieving net zero, decreasing emissions from the previous year as well. And really, some people have been quite critical of this, you know, have said that this is just them trying to rebuild their reputation from 2015. And in 2015, you may remember this, but Volkswagen had their cars tested and there had been a defeat device put into diesel engines that could detect when they were being tested, which would then activate emissions controls. So basically they were fraudulent in their tests. Millions of cars were affected and as a result were then recalled. So this was a negative step towards climate change because it would mean that they weren't being honest about the CO2 that their cars were emitting. And therefore, you know, this is not helpful for helping the issue of climate change. But in saying that, they've learned their lesson from 2015 They are now producing electric cars, phasing out coal, are trying to be climate neutral or get to net zero. So they are serious now about their commitment to climate change and really trying to tackle climate change. So that was a big video, but to basically summarize what we've looked at here, we've looked at different responses. We've looked at Volkswagen, the US, Brazil, Australia, China, and the Paris Climate Agreement. We've looked at what was effective and what was ineffective about it. I hope that was helpful. And if you need any help, please reach out.